Monotype. Hey there, I'm Christopher Olin.
And I'm Mia Sullivan, and we produce Creative Characters.
We do, don't we?
You usually don't hear our voices on the podcast.
We like to stay behind the scenes. But you're hearing us today because we are hosting.
Actually, we're not really hosting, Chris. We're doing something kind of different.
You're right. We're hijacking the intro. That's because it's August and our wonderful podcast team is taking a much needed break. Some are hitting the beach for one last hurrah of summer. Others are actually hard at work preparing for the next visit to Adobe Max. And that means that this week we are replaying an earlier episode, one that goes way back to our first season, the second episode, in fact.
Yeah, so this episode's a conversation between our very own Charles Nix and Scott Starrett. So Scott is behind the 2016 campaign design for AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
And at the time, AOC was running for a congressional seat in New York, the seat she still holds today. And Charles had always wanted to hear the story behind that poster.
So we pulled this from the back catalog because, well, it's campaign season. And with elections right around the corner, we've been thinking about how candidates are visually designing their campaigns.
Yeah, and visual design is obviously what this is all about. So for context, Mia, some folks might not have seen AOC's 2016 campaign poster. Some people may have seen it, but it's been a while. So give us kind of like the brief rundown of what it looks like.
So first off, the poster has an image of AOC right in front, which is something you don't always see, a candidate putting their face on the branding in that way. She looks bold and authentic. And her poster was dual language, so English-Spanish. AOC's own background is Puerto Rican American. And just the way it's designed, the colors, the type, the angles, they reference past political movements.
And in this episode, Scott describes those political movements, the ones that directly influenced his design ideas. And as we listened back through the episode, we wondered, are any current campaign designs in this 2024 cycle showing up as striking as AOC's 2016 design? Listeners, if you've seen a campaign design during this election cycle that stands out, let us know. Write us at podcast@monotype.com, or you can record a voice memo and send it in, same email address.
Or reach out to us on Instagram or TikTok at @bymonotype. Okay, let's hand it over to Charles Nix and Scott Starrett.
Hi, I'm Charles Nix. I'm a creative type director for Monotype, and I'm here today with Scott Starrett from Tandem Design in New York City. Scott, I first became aware of your work in my own neighborhood, walking down the street one morning during election season in 2016. And there on a telephone pole was a AOC poster, my first glance at one, and I realized she was running for Joe Crowley's seat, and I thought, she is going to eat his lunch. It's weird for me, being a designer and a type designer and typographer, to suddenly be so struck by a piece of design and typography, but it was one of those rare instances where I was the layperson. I was the audience for the message, and it really got through to me. So let's start there with how you got involved with that campaign.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here and honored to be talking to you and talking on a podcast related to such a storied and renowned company. So thank you for the invitation and thank you for having me. The story, I think, is a big part of the charm and a big part of why this thing has legs, why it's traveled, because I think it's one of these rare instances where, this thing that came together, that touched you, it was born from a really grassroots, honest place. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was a friend of mine, was a friend of our studios. She worked at a little bar around the corner from our office. And, one day we were all sitting in the bar talking politics, and we started talking about how we can contribute to the world, to, this idea of this new world after the 2016 election, where it seemed so pressing for people to involve themselves in civic engagement like never before. So I was on the search for tacos. Before we met her, I was on the search for tacos because I'd come from Austin, Texas. And one day I popped into a little hole in the wall just around the corner from our studio. And the place just struck me as something special. And shortly after, we met Alexandria, whom we called Sandy at the time. There are a few other Alexes and Alexandrias in her family. So that was her nickname. Now the world knows her as AOC, obviously. But, it just started from friendship. It started from, just kicking around ideas, talking politics in a pretty casual way with a lot of other folks in the little taco shop. That turned into her eventually suggesting that she was going to run for Congress, and us saying, as a studio, we were on board and we'd do whatever it took. And here we are.
Well, so you make it sound there like up to that point, you guys were just running a little studio and you went out for tacos, but that wasn't the first time you dabbled in politics. That wasn't the first time that you had sort of decided that publicity, marketing, and design could come together to make a difference in politics.
No,
was it?
That's true. No, not by any means. And I think you're onto something. I think these stories, the more we tell them, the tidier it becomes. But no, the reality is that both myself and Alexandria had worked in politics, and a lot of what we talked about is how the sausage is made, what we did and didn't like about our behind the scenes peeks into politics. I had spent 4 years previously when I lived in Austin, Texas, where I mentioned we eat tacos 3 times a day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And in that time, I worked as a creative director for a small political communications firm. And we did work, at the municipal level all the way up to the state level. Spent a lot of my time in the Capitol, working on policy efforts as well. I worked as a strategist and a creative in that world. And so I had a lot of ideas about politics, and I had a lot of frustration having come from the world of marketing prior to trying my hand at politics. I had a lot of frustration with the idea that I was working for and with progressive politicians who just didn't seem like they were communicating that that's who they were. It felt like if you were to switch the color palette from blue to red, most folks were indistinguishable from the other party. You wouldn't be able to tell if they're Republican or a Democrat if you strip those signifying colors away. And I felt like that was wrong. I did not feel like that was an authentic or honest way for these candidates to represent themselves. They were trying to tell a story that was prefabricated, that was expected of them. And I think that had a lot to do with risk aversion. So when it came time to work on this campaign, not only had I done a little bit of work with the folks that Sandy worked with along the way, the Justice Democrats, and some other initiatives prior in New York, everyone was a little more interested in what might happen if the progressive side of the political spectrum were to take a little more risk. And I think that Sandy was not only the perfect partner in that endeavor, she was also, and still is, a champion of taking those risks in politics.
I have to remember that because I get very excited about AOC and my district and politics generally, but I have to remember that folks are very interested in the design. I mean, you and I might think of it as the design is sort of the end of a process, but for a lot of people, it's the start of a conversation. So can you talk just a little bit about how the typography, design, color palette, all of it sort of developed with AOC?
Yeah, absolutely. In our studio, we didn't just fall from the sky. We had been working in the industry in design. We had a couple years as a studio under our belt, occasionally dabbling in things like video and copywriting. But I've always been an adherent to a pretty strict process, a process that's pretty heavy on research and discovery, and it tries to uncover what's at the core or what the ethos of a particular subject that we're communicating on behalf of is. And that's what our process really seeks to do. And so although this was a pro bono, we started with that same in-depth process because that's the only way I know how to produce good results. First of all, I've spent a good portion of a lifetime learning about progressive politics, learning about movements to the best of my ability. And on the second hand, Alexandria was a friend of ours that we had access to, where we were able to tap into her personal ideas and her personal thoughts and hear what she had to say about a wide array of things. And that is invaluable time for a young designer in the research and discovery process, and absorb that ethos firsthand. It did amazing things for our ability when the time came to put ideas down on paper, and then we tend to generally stop and say, okay, has this been done before? One of the first places my mind went was to Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, United Farm Workers. And at the beginning of the farm workers' strike, when you're preparing people in a grassroots movement to go out and picket, some of the embellishment, some of the flourish falls by the wayside. And that was something that we really wanted to capture in the typography, for example. Is this logo so complex that it can't be drawn by somebody that works in the organization? If that's the case, what are we saying? That all kind of came together and led us down this path that some of us are familiar with today, of what kind of stands as her 2018 campaign branding.
Well, I like, in looking at the work that you did for Organizing Corps in 2020, you actually use a hand-painted version of the artwork for the promotion on your website.
That's right.
It's funny, it was a part of some discussions that I heard around, corporate identity in the 80s and 90s, where somebody would say, if somebody can draw that logo, if somebody can draw it on a napkin and get the essence of it, then you've won. You've got something that people can really respond to. But I like the idea that it's not imitation, it's use, something that they can use that not only speaks their language, but is useful to them.
With the Organizing Corps brand, I really appreciate you bringing that up. When you see that on our website, I think the reason we put that up is because for us, it was one of our main goals was being able to make this thing so accessible that when kids went out to do field work, which is what Organizing Corps was there for, to train college juniors to go work the field in the 2020 presidential election. In field organizing, you're working on white pads, big pads of paper and whiteboards. You need to be able to draw it. It means something if it's that accessible. And these kids, we didn't put that in a brand standards manual or anything. They just did it on their own. They just took to it. So for us, that is a point of honor.
Yeah, it immediately struck me when I saw it. I was like, wow, that is a mark that's become part of the group. Well, can we step back even further? What you're doing now, and even the story of AOC is sort of this like tail that's wagging the dog of your larger design story. It's probably a fulcrum, but it's not the full arc. So let's go back to the very beginning. Where do you come from? Where did you go to school? How did you end up at that moment where Alexandria is your friend and you're looking for tacos?
Yeah, it involves a little wandering, a lot of hard work, some serious luck, and then kismet, I'd say. I took what you could call an unconventional path into the world of design. I grew up in Kansas, and I went to state school. I went to the University of Kansas. And, that program doesn't get mentioned, obviously, along with the RISDs of the world when you talk about art schools, for example. But I learned a really practical application of my craft. But Kansas just wasn't quite the right frequency for me. So I moved to Austin, Texas, which certainly is a little more upbeat and has an extremely vibrant culture. Their music scene is obviously world-renowned, but there's a ton of hand-painted signage and bespoke branding that goes on in Austin. And I learned a lot in that time, and specifically found myself chasing my interests into politics. And that's where I worked as a creative director at a political communications firm. At that point, when we look at the world and it can be tough. It can be tough for some young designers to figure out exactly where they want to specialize. Our world so often breaks us up in between specialists and generalists in a sense. And it tends to look oftentimes like the people that just put all their effort into that one track, that they move a little quicker. And so I think it takes some faith to follow that generalist track. And I say that because, part of me wondered if I had kind of fully committed myself away from the sort of sense of a traditional design studio by taking this turn towards marketing, towards politics. When I was trained as a graphic designer and an illustrator, it felt like I was in the world of strategy a little more. And so when I moved from Austin to New York, I kind of wanted to get back into the world of graphic design. And the studio I ended up forming with Sean Gillen kind of has its roots in the Swiss approach to design. There's a connection from our studio to Cincinnati, which has a connection to Michael Beirut and Massimo Vignelli. And I think everybody in the design industry has a great deal of admiration for that approach to design as well. I think living outside of that world for so long also taught me that there is a lot of out of the box thinking that can be done. And so eventually those worlds merged, and my impulses, I think, kept drawing me towards pro bono work that had to do with advocacy organizations, and ultimately it dragged me right back into politics. But I have to say that stint in a more traditional graphic design approach, as a visual communication studio, which we operated as for a while, I think the blending of my previous education and that approach to design really culminated in that kismet that put me in the right place at the right time. Our senior designer, Maria Reynes, she had never worked on a political design campaign before. Most of my pro bono work took place in after hours or on the weekends, and it wasn't very profitable, so we weren't bringing it into studio time. We brought this into the studio fully, and she really, brought this more traditional or kind of brought the industry of graphic design into politics along with me. And so the stars aligned in a very unique way and put us in a very unique place at a very unique time.
There are a couple of things in what you just said that are really striking. This idea that it is a little bit more risky, at least initially, and probably in the midterm too, to be a generalist than it is to be a specialist. For those of us who are trained as generalists, you just think that's just the way you are. But it is easy to sort of look out of your periphery and see other people who are getting ahead in these really specific tracks and think, am I missing something? Like, should I have committed to a really specific thing? But there's also something in you that doesn't allow you to do that you actually have to bring the breadth of your experience to the table. And even when you try to create, and this is the second thing, even when you try to create something as specific as a design firm or as a company dedicated to design, the strength of your experience and your morals sort of bleeds into it. It almost pushed this to the fore. So politics and social thinking are not a side thing for you. But there must be other things. And again, I'm going to try and bring things back to typography. What else do you do besides politics? Are there things that are just run of the mill with Tandem?
Absolutely. I think now I would say, I guess, politics, social advocacy have become run of the mill. That's kind of a dream come true. And I think it's rare and not something every firm necessarily has control over. It is an honor to be able to work in this space. But, as a lot of the listeners can probably assume, the budgets are a little different in that world. And so we do supplement with some industry or commercial, however you want to refer to it, work that's outside of this social space. We have metrics that we use internally to help us decide whether this organization, aligns with our values, whether we're doing any harm by supporting an organization or a company or corporation. And there are certainly corporations that we've turned down, even though the budgets might be really, really appealing. In the long run, it's not the direction we want to go. So that is one of the harder things to come to terms with, especially if you've ever had to be really scrappy. But some of my proudest moments come from saying no to projects. But at the same time, we have worked all over the place when it comes to kind of that traditional work. It tends to be less and less these days. I think especially in this very heightened political environment, if I said that in the most diplomatic way. There's a lot of work that feels very pressing right now. But at the same time, we don't turn our nose up at good old-fashioned work.
If your business is the politics of change, then yes, business is booming right now. It is the time. So your relationship with typography, you mentioned the tangent or the vector that goes to the University of Cincinnati that sort of connects to the international style, mid-century modernism, Massimo Vignelli, Michael Beirut, sort of neo-international. But that doesn't come through in the work that's in your portfolio. We don't see any sort of dogmatic application of style. Instead, I think we see a much more conceptual application of style, or style born out of concept. For instance, the squarish caps that you're using for AOC's 2016 and 2018 campaign don't exist in the italic. Did you commission the italics for those, or how did the specifics of that typography develop?
Yeah, we actually sheared that typeface is the term, and it worked pretty well. That doesn't always work to create that kind of oblique slant, but with this typeface, Nor'Wester, designed by Jamie Wilson, it absolutely worked. And it absolutely created that sense of urgency that we were looking for, and that subtle nod towards progress, which is accompanied by the 3/4 gaze that you see in the 2018 campaign poster that I think is the most recognizable form of our work. But we didn't commission that specifically. We found that typeface knowing that we needed a very condensed typeface, just based on the functionality of such a long name, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There was just a great deal of time at the beginning spent saying, how do we make such a long name accessible? And so condensed letter forms quickly became sort of the obvious go-to.
It's funny because it did end up in the end looking less like it was crammed into that space, and it looked more like, this is optimism, this is joy. It's like full of confidence. It didn't look like it was cramped. And I, again, if I go to it with my designer hat on, of course I can see that you need to condense, right. In the way that, Obama doesn't.
Right.
But AOC, of course, has a lot of characters going on there. But yeah, it comes off as, like I said, feeling joyful, feeling optimistic, and feeling confident. And the 3/4 gaze, of course, really helps.
Yeah. And before we even had that image supporting that mark or that typography as we'd set it up, there was a stamp that we'd found in our research phase of Cesar Chavez, kind of giving a similar look to what just feels immediately like towards the future. And that was something that I tried to get politicians to do in the past in my work in Austin. And I think they all just felt a little silly and a little uncomfortable. And maybe it took 2016, such a reckoning, such a real moment and a visceral moment for so many of us, especially folks, on the progressive side of politics. Maybe it took that moment for people to start saying, okay, it's not cheesy, it's real. Like, we really need to look towards a better future. But in addition to, trying not to make them look cramped, and the Congresswoman wanted her full name because it's important for her to both pay respect to her mother and her father. And I think that is a very authentic reason to have made those choices. Sometimes as designers, we think we know better because a thing is hard. And when you run a cost benefit analysis, you say, come on, man, let's just pick one name. But in this case, we knew her well enough to know that we shouldn't push back on that because there's a good reason for it. And the same went with her first name. She wanted to just use her full name. That felt right to her. That felt honest to her. That is, she felt that she didn't want to be using a nickname. She wanted to run as who she truly was and to lean into the name her parents had given her and her cultural heritage as well. And the other thing that we wanted to do when we looked at that typography, as we touched on a little bit, is make it look accessible, make it look like it could have been cut out of construction paper. So when you look at traditional campaign branding through the ages, you see a lot of high chroma reds and blues so that you really get someone's attention and you really make sure they know you're patriotic. You see stars and stripes and waving flags, and then when the 90s hit and desktop publishing and the proliferation of our design software really took off and became accessible, you see people start to signal these little nuances. If a 12-year-old can do it in Photoshop, we started to design a way so that it was a little more challenging, so that you show you're a little more put together, right? Mm-hmm. That's where things like drop shadows and gradients start coming in, or even skeuomorphic effects. So buttons feel like a button you could push, And these little signals, I think, are meant to say this campaign is well-funded, so well-funded that we can spend a little extra on design. We've really got it together here. But I think those signals over time started to become stale, and they started to project something about money and design that certainly wasn't right for our moment. Mm-hmm. And the idea of dressing Alexandria up as a longtime politician that knew inside and out the industry of politics, put her in a pantsuit, tons of stars and stripes, waving flags, gradients, drop shadows. That was going to come off as really disingenuous. She was a member of the working class that was going to run on behalf of the working class to make advancements for the working class, and for all people. It was meant to be an inclusive concept. And those ideas that signal campaigns' war chest, their budget, and how put together they are, those started to read really wrong in this context. And so we took it in what now can be said as a pretty drastically separate direction.
Well, let's move from, the place I want to move to next is actually tangentially related, which is the Green New Deal posters for the parks and the typography of those, which is decidedly different. It's sort of, it's very much harkens back to a WPA style, which is not completely unrelated, but has its sort of, cut from working class American cloth, but not without sort of artistic credentials. So, I think to the WPA guide to New York that was put together and the cover for that, and that sort of WPA style of stencil artwork. But you managed through the typography to develop something that harkens back to that without being so cloying. So talk a little bit about the development of that design, typography, and art direction.
I will happily talk about that. As a studio, our first design collaboration with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, we were kind of given room to explore, room to run. There were plenty of mandates that came down from the campaign, things we should be thinking about, events we needed to create solutions for. But we're also looking at the challenge being, how do we make the Green New Deal a dinner table conversation? That's our design prompt. That's the challenge. How do we get into the lives of everyday Americans and convince them that this is something worth paying attention to? This is a topic that's going to affect everyone, because you really need to create a critical mass. Maybe everyone doesn't agree with you, but at least everybody has an opinion on to even get it, into the minds of all Americans. And so that's a pretty hardy task, to be laid upon a small design studio. But at the same time, it was one we were game for. And we use history a lot in our studio. And if you have the space to pay homage and to add these layers of meaning that have connections to stories that provide a historical and an educational context, then I think you're doing your job as a designer, because we're all coming, from a collaborative standpoint. And so when we had the chance to think about, when have people confronted big ideas like this before? Well, it's baked right into the name. I think we're perfectly aligned with Alexandria in our design approach and her approach to thinking about the Green New Deal. Obviously it's a reference to the New Deal, which has its connection to that WPA art that you're referencing. And I've always admired and appreciated the national parks posters specifically that came out of that Federal One arts project. It had a direct connection to what we wanted to talk about. And it had these layers of meaning that were already baked in that just needed to be connected. And then if you can create something that captures people's attention, there are conversations to be had, which are being had out there on Twitter now. Generally, when these get posted by somebody, the first comment we get is Russian, Soviet, communist propaganda or Nazi propaganda. Right. And so the interesting thing about that is that those folks were actually cribbing our semi-socialist artwork that was going on in our country. As we were putting these posters together and thinking, obviously we want to show this vision of what the future can be. And we're also looking to the past to say, look, we've done this before. We cared about, as a nation, our national parks. We cared about parks. We can do that with city parks. We can care about these publicly held, this public trust, if you will.
It's very much the way that when I saw them, because they're like, it's like AOC Generation 2, or version 3.0. Like, okay, now she's there. Now she's trying to do the work that we've hired her to do.
Right.
So we put her there because we believed what she said. And now she's doing it. And in seeing those, I was like, oh, yeah, it is. We have done this before, that we need to get people to feel a sort of comfort with this idea of thinking progressively again. And design is a great way to do that, because it's got all of the sort of visual earmarks and visual language to help people feel a comfort with thinking differently. I mean, art does that. But the thing that came up when I saw them is that I've only ever seen them digitally. I've never seen them in person.
We'll have to change that.
Yeah, well, thank you. But in this 2020, I mean, they've still been very striking to me, despite the fact that I've never seen them or held them. And, this is a year where we've all been sort of forced to connect with people digitally constantly, and to not have that as many sort of physical reminders of ideas or of people or whatever, but instead everything's just sort of being given to us digitally. How do you guys, as Tandem and as connected as you are to this idea of bringing ideas to people, how do you deal with this digital transformation, or this moment where we're all digital?
That is a fantastic question. And if I'm being honest, I struggle with it. Being out in the world and even my commute to Manhattan every day was such a vital portion of my daily design education. Seeing the tote bags that people carry, seeing the shows people watch on their phone, what newspapers or magazines they're looking at, what books they're reading. I love being out in the real world. Social media isn't my primary interest, but at the same time, it is this very real transition. I'm experimenting with the value of a digital presentation versus an in-person talk. What your Zoom background, how can that play into your talk? How you can bring people between different applications on your desktop in a way you wouldn't if you were just standing up giving a slide presentation. And, in our studio, we've been delivering Zoom backgrounds for people.
Right. I wonder, I like you, I swim through the visual environment that's New York City. Like, I feel the subway is It's like it's your own private critique of graphic design every single day.
That's right.
You go in and you get a chance to really stare at something for a very long time. That's a physical piece of graphic culture. And then on the way home, it's a different car, a different set of posters, different stimuli, different audience even. And we see posters, when I bike into the city, you're still confronted with wheat pasted posters. There's much more of a sort of a physical graphic culture to interact with. And I feel very, very divorced from that right now, this month, last month, and the month before, of that daily dose of graphic culture. But I wonder if we're suddenly confronting a graphic reality that's much more like what the rest of the country deals with regularly. We're so pampered and seeing physical graphic design all the time. That said, though, it strikes me in listening to you talk about both the physical and the digital, the ability to travel much more of the world virtually, to see and take in more viewpoints and hear more people speak, that there is the imitation of physical things, graphic design wise, and then there is the culture that is made specifically for that digital environment. And I see both in the work that you guys do. I see some of each, like things that are made specifically for the digital world, and things that are made quite obviously to be seen, at a park.
I think that tangible digital divide is a binary that I certainly grew up in my design training. It was kind of the focus at the time. 3-4 years ago, we would talk to a lot of young designers that would suggest they only wanted to go into print. And that was a conversation we were having when I was in school. And I think it kind of feels absurd now. You could go into publishing, but those worlds have blended up, and, it's not such a binary anymore. I think, yes, a hand painted thing is a nicer thing on some level than a screen printed thing. But really, it is the ideas, it is the heart of the thing that matters. And so making it ubiquitous or making it accessible doesn't have to diminish its conceptual value.
My son, who's 10, a big AOC and Green New Deal supporter because it directly impacts him, is also obsessed with watching shows about magic. Not necessarily doing magic, but watching somebody tricking other people. Mm-hmm. And he understands that it's a trick, obviously. But there's something in that strikes me as part of the excitement of seeing a picture of something is really impressive. Like, I look at your posters for the Green New Deal, and I can sense, based on my knowledge of how the physical world works, that this image of this thing represents something really magical. Like, that it's involves labor, and the thing itself will be impressive. But somehow, just like my son watching people be fooled by magic on television, I'm being fooled, but I believe at the end of it that there's something really exciting. Let's go back and just talk about the same designer who created the rounded square capitals that you italicized and used for AOC's posters back in 2016 also designed the Green New Deal type for you. Is that true?
That's right. Jamie Wilson, who designed Nor'Wester, a typeface that we used because it felt like it was born out of necessity in a similar way to some of the lettering that we found in United Farm Workers placards and their signs they used for protest. So we used that typeface. Being conscientious communicators, it's important to think about whether the type designer was a woman or, what intention the type designer might have had, or where this typeface has been used in the past, so that those references and those layers of meaning I refer to all align. And so we suddenly found ourselves in a place where we created this thing that everyone was feeling good about. We'd even shown the campaign, but I hadn't done due diligence. And so we looked into Nor'Wester. Jamie Wilson, as I've mentioned a few times, designed it. And all he asked for in return, because we were like, oh my goodness, also in order to use this on a bigger scale, how much might we need to pay? We didn't look into that as well, because you need to pay your type designers. I'll just say it outright.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All he asked for was a donation to the IJM, whose mission is to end slavery in our lifetime. So we kind of lucked out. We made a pretty hearty donation, but it couldn't have been more aligned. He reached out to us and said, thank you for using his type. He was so excited to have seen the context in which it was used. And that started a relationship where we obviously just gushed about his work and thanked him for creating such a usable typeface that fit right in with what we were doing. So when the time came to do the Green New Deal posters, it turned out that the typeface that we were considering relying on, that mimics in some ways those national parks posters, designed by an avid and outspoken Trump supporter. And I don't think Fox News usually picks up typography-based stories, but I could be certain, and I could already see the Breitbart headline.
As night follows day, it would get out there, yes.
And so we had to make some serious choices. In the process of drawing those characters and making those choices, we brought Jamie back into the mix, and he helped us design it with a few forms. We absolutely have every intention of releasing that out for free someday. And we hope that's sooner than later. We've got a few more styles to add. We want to create something robust enough that it's useful to everybody. But Jamie Wilson saved the day. Our type designer, once again, helped put a finer point on our work in that case. It's kind of a beautiful story about typography.
I mean, I know it applies to things beyond type design. I know it does. Like, everyone should have a friend who's a type designer for instances just as that. I mean, I've given type designs for wedding presents before.
Right.
But there's so many instances in life where if you pick up the phone and call somebody or bother to get to know somebody who makes something that you need, be it words, be it letters, be it illustration, it can, I mean, at very least you get to talk to somebody interesting or to find out whether you like somebody, which is, I mean, there's a great deal of value in that. But making friends with the type designer and having somebody who you can go to just to ask typographic questions, I think it's fantastic. I mean, I think the same thing about photography and writers, and just being able to ask them questions about their particular interests is really one of the joys of life.
I think what that does, if you seek out those people that do things that I think most people tend to just consider niche or peripheral to the things they do, in talking to those people, you find how central these things are and how much work goes in to the nuances of our daily life. And I think that's something that I worry about in this digital world. I think that's something I worry about as everyone, it kind of is forced into their own little cocoon, as it were, that will lose connection to just how much work goes into this big, beautiful world, this big, beautiful society that we've all created together.
There's a great deal of joy for me in seeing people pursue, as you do and as Tandem does, the idea of the greater social good through the work that you do. And it just happens to be graphic design, so I feel particularly compelled by it. But it's been great talking to you. And I thank you for all the work that you've done. I look forward to seeing much more work from you guys going forward.
Thank you, Charles. And I have to say, I appreciate all of the work that you do. And it's been a true honor, like I said, to be invited here to have this, what just turned out to be a wonderful conversation. So thank you.
Oh, shucks.
Thanks for listening. If you want to check out more work from Scott and his team at Tandem, look for a link to his website in the show notes of this episode.
Thank you for listening to this episode. We love all of the support that we get from you, our listeners. If you've been enjoying our podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify to rate and review this episode. And if you really like us, subscribe to the show and share us with your friends. Creative Characters is brought to you by Monotype. It is produced by Christopher Olin and Mia Sullivan.